The deadliest massacre in the Reconstruction era in Louisiana happened 150 years ago. By Lorraine Boisonnault, published for the Smithsonian Magazine. On September 28, 2018. In September 1868, Southern white Democrats hunted down around 200 African Americans in an effort to suppress voter turnout. Reading the note found on the schoolhouse door by its intended recipient, Emerson Bentley, a white school teacher, he found the message in early September of 1868, illustrated with a coffin, a skull and bones, and a dagger dripping with blood. The straightforward message represented a menacing threat to Bentley, who was teaching African American children in Louisiana at the time. Little could the Ohio-born Republican have predicted just how soon that violence would come about. Bentley, an 18-year-old who also worked as one of the editors of the Republican paper, the St. Landry Progress, was one of the few white Republicans in the Louisiana parish of St. Landry. He and others came to the region to assist recently emancipated African Americans to find jobs, access education, and become politically active. With Louisiana passing a new state constitution in April 1868 that included male enfranchisement and access to state schools regardless of color, Bentley had reason to feel optimistic about the state's future. But Southern white Democrats were nowhere near willing to concede the power they'd held for decades, before the Civil War. And in St. Landry, one of the largest and most populous parishes in the state, thousands of white men were eager to take up arms to defend their political power. The summer of 1868 was a tumultuous one. With the help of tens of thousands of black citizens who finally had the right to vote, Republicans handily won local and state elections that spring. Henry Clay Warmoth, a Republican, won the race for state governor, but the votes African Americans cast for those elections cost them. Over the summer, armed white men harassed black families, shot at them outside of Opelousas, the largest city in St. Landry Parish, and killed men, women, and children with impunity. Editors of Democratic newspapers repeatedly warned of dire consequences if the Republican Party continued winning victories at the polls. Those editorials spurred Democrats to action and instigated violence everywhere, wrote Warmoth in his book War, Politics, and Reconstruction, Stormy Days in Louisiana. Secret Democratic organizations were formed, and all armed. We had the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, and an Italian organization called the Innocents, who nightly paraded the streets of New Orleans and the roads in the country parishes, producing terror among the Republicans. The vigilante groups were so widespread that they often included nearly every white man in the region. One Democratic newspaper editor estimated that more than 3,000 men belonged to the Knights of the White Camellia of St. Landry Parish, an area that included only 13,776 white people in total, including women and children. With the approach of the presidential elections in November, the tension only increased. On September 13, the Republicans held a meeting in the town of Washington, not far from Opelousas, and found streets lined with armed Seymour Knights. A misfired rifle nearly caused a riot to break out, but in the end, everyone departed peacefully, though the Democrats threatened Bentley if he failed to publish an honest account of the event in the St. Landry Progress. Sure enough, they used Bentley's account, in which he wrote the man had been intimidating the Republicans, to instigate a wave of violence on September 28, 1868. Displeased with the way Bentley had portrayed the Democrats John Williams, and James R. Dixon, who later became a local judge, and Constable Sebastian May visited Bentley's schoolhouse to make good on the anonymous threats of the earlier September note. They forced him to sign a retraction of the article, and then Dixon savagely beat Bentley, sending the children who were sitting for lessons scattering in terror. Rumors spread, and soon many Republicans were convinced Bentley had been killed, though he managed to escape with his life. As a small number of African Americans prepared to rescue Bentley, word spread around the parish that a black rebellion was imminent. Thousands of white men began arming themselves and raiding houses around the area. St. Landrians reacted to armed Negroes and rumors of an uprising in the same manner that Southerners had reacted for generations, wrote historian Carolyn Delatt in 1976.
If anything, the vengeance visited upon the Negro population was greater, as blacks were no longer protected by any consideration of their monetary value.
On the first night, only one small group of armed African Americans assembled to deal with the report they'd heard about Bentley. They were met by an armed group of white men, mounted on horses, outside Opelousas. Of those men, 29 were taken to the local prison, and 27 of them were summarily executed. The bloodshed continued for 2 weeks, with African American families killed in their homes, shot in public, and chased down by vigilante groups. C.E. Durand, the other editor of the St. Landry Progress, was murdered in the early days of the massacre, and his body was displayed outside the Opelousas drug store. By the end of the 2 weeks, estimates of the number killed were around 250 people, the vast majority of them African American. When the Bureau of Freedmen, a governmental organization created to provide emancipated African Americans with legal, health, and educational assistance and help them settle abandoned lands, sent Lieutenant Jesse Lee to investigate, he called it a quiet reign of terror so far as the freed people were concerned. Influential Republican Beverly Wilson, an African American blacksmith in Opelousas, believed black citizens were in a worse condition now than in slavery. Another observer was led outside the town of Opelousas and shown the half-buried bodies of more than a dozen African Americans. But Democratic papers, the only remaining sources of news in the region, as all Republican presses had been burned, downplayed the horrific violence. The people generally are well satisfied with the result of the St. Landry riot, only they regret that the carpetbaggers escaped, wrote Daniel Dennett, editor of the Democratic Franklin Planters Banner. The editor escaped, and 100 dead Negroes, and perhaps 100 more wounded and crippled, a dead white radical, a dead Democrat, and 3 or 4 wounded Democrats are the upshot of the business. The groups managed to achieve their ultimate purpose, as was borne out by the results of the November presidential elections. Even though Republican nominee Ulysses Grant won, not a single Republican vote was counted in St. Landry Parish. Those who oversaw the election felt fully convinced that no man on that day could have voted any other than the Democratic ticket and not been killed inside of 24 hours thereafter. St. Landry Parish illustrates the local shift of power after 1868, where an instance of conservative boss rule occurred and the parish Republican Party was unable to fully recover for the remainder of Reconstruction, writes historian Matthew Christensen. There would be no Republican organization in the parish for the next 4 years, and no Republican paper until 1876. The Opelousas Massacre also set the stage for future acts of violence and intimidation. Lynching became routinized in Louisiana, a systematic way by which whites sought to assert white supremacy in response to African American resistance, said historian Michael Pfeiffer, the author of The Roots of Rough Justice, Origins of American Lynching, by email. This would be an important precedent for the subsequent wave of lynchings that occurred in Louisiana from the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century, in which lynch mobs killed more than 400 persons, most of them African American. Yet for all that it was the deadliest instance of racial violence during the Reconstruction period, the Opelousas Massacre is little remembered today. Only slightly better known is the 1873 Colfax Massacre, in which an estimated 60 to 150 people were killed, a massacre largely following the pattern set by Opelousas. The United States has done comparatively little until quite recently to memorialize its history of significant racial violence, Pfeiffer said. Reconstruction remains contested in local memory, and efforts to remember the achievements of Reconstruction are canceled out by the seeming failure of the period to achieve lasting change.